Everybody, welcome back to English 90. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 10th of November, where I wanted to talk about the next essay. As you know, we've been reading essays, and that essay is about propaganda techniques in today's advertising. Now that we've already talked about two essays, and we talked a little bit about same sex schools, and then we also talked a little bit about the internet, Google. So I wanted to talk about that essay as well as continue talking about quotation, which I had started in a previous class. And also remind you that registration began yesterday. That's the 9th of November on Tuesday. And you can see in the notes below, I have the link which you can access all of the course schedule options that we've got. But you can also just go directly to the GCC website and do that as well. And what you will have is a list of classes, not just for the spring semester, but also for the intersession. The intersession is in January. This is that period of time in January where we have a holiday and there wouldn't normally be classes. However, we do offer a limited number of classes that basically are the equivalent of a 16-week class, but they meet only for 3.5 weeks. So how do they do that? Basically, those classes meet Monday through Friday, several hours a day. So it's highly intense. However, it does serve a certain group of students, and while we don't offer the full complement of classes that we normally offer at GCC, we have a good number of classes to choose from during the intersession. I teach actually one of these classes during the intersession. I teach a public speaking class. And actually, what I found is that usually the classes are smaller and that the students are pretty dedicated. I think they'd have to be pretty dedicated if they were going to basically be putting themselves through a 3.5 week academic semester. But the good news is that after that period of time, they've completed the requirements for that particular course. So, in terms of thinking about your next step, this class, English 90, is supposed to prepare you for the introductory level English class that just about all students have to take at GCC. Is what we call English Comp 1 or English 101. And the idea behind English 101 is that that class is going to prepare you for the kinds of college writing that you will be doing in other classes. So basically, our class has been a kind of review of the basic elements of writing and reading so that when you get to English 101, you've already got those skills in place, and then English 101 can refine and develop those. And you can see that we offer many sections of English 101. They are offered at different times of day in different formats. Some are live, some are online, some are hybrid, which means they're partially online and they're also partially live, with a whole number of different teachers as well. So you've got a lot of options from which to choose for your English 101. And I do recommend that you take English 101 next semester. Usually, what we recommend is that once you begin with your English and your math, you continue until you have satisfied your requirements so that you don't begin to forget things. But that's something that you can talk about with your advisor. If you don't know who your advisor is, you should be able to look that up on my GCC and be able to find that. And if your advisor hasn't contacted you yet, you can certainly contact your advisor and talk a little bit about what your academic plans are for the future. And also talk a little bit about your career goals and just in general what some of your ambitions are. So advisors here at GCC are basically faculty that also serve in an advisory capacity to help you put together a schedule. And usually students are assigned an advisor initially when they first start at GCC. And then you can either maintain that advisor, or as you continue on in your academic journey, if you happen to have a teacher that you have some sort of a rapport connection with, you can always ask that teacher to serve as your advisor. Or if it turns out that you decide that you are going to specialize in a particular academic area, say something like nursing, then it would make a lot of sense that your advisor would be somebody in the nursing area. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the registration process, and I encourage you to register for classes sooner rather than later so that you've got a whole range of options. And if you have any questions about registration, feel free to ask me. I'd be happy to assist you in whatever way I can. So I thought I'd move forward a little bit and talk about your second paper, which at this point should have already been submitted. So I am going to be working on them and evaluating them much like I evaluated the first paper to get them back to you. That was the 3-paragraph essay. And while certainly you could write more, you couldn't write less. And what I was looking for was a well-developed introductory paragraph, a well-developed body paragraph, and a well-developed concluding paragraph. And once you are comfortable writing a well-developed introduction and conclusion, then it's just a question of how do you divide up your body paragraphs based on the number of pieces of evidence that you have. So in terms of paper number 3, that will be due on the 29th of November. That's a Monday, so we've got some time for our distribution of paper topics, and also for the return of paper number 2, which you would have with you before you begin paper number 3. Paper number 3, if you've been thinking about the progression of essays and doing the readings that I've indicated in the syllabus, then it's probably not too surprised that we're not too much of a surprise that we're moving from the 3-paragraph essay to the 5-paragraph essay. You always have to maintain the introductory paragraph and the concluding paragraph. So it's a question of how many body paragraphs do you have? And if we were to have 3 pieces of evidence, and I've been suggesting 3 is the minimum, then you could, in theory, devote an entire paragraph to each piece of evidence. And if you were to do that, 3 pieces of evidence in the middle, in other words, 3 body paragraphs, with an introductory paragraph and a concluding paragraph, that gives you your 5-paragraph essay. And if you're looking at the length and development of paragraphs that we've been discussing, you've probably got a 2-page paper there, maybe even 3-page paper, depending on the length. So usually in college, professors ask for page numbers rather than numbers of paragraphs. So if a teacher were to ask you for a 2 to 3-page paper, we're talking about something like a 5 or 6-paragraph essay. And the only difference between that and, let's say, a 5-page paper is just how many body paragraphs do you put in there, or in other words, how many pieces of evidence are you going to be inserting. And I also want to let you know that as we get closer to the ending of November, November 22nd or so, I have a class scheduled that's called Practice Final, because there is a final exam for our particular course. The idea behind this class is that it'll prepare you to do writing at home that you would submit at a later date. That's the ideal kind of writing. However, sometimes you also have to write in the moment, and you don't necessarily have weeks in which you can develop an idea and edit and refine and so forth. So what I'm going to do is, for the practice final, is I will be trying to replicate what we would actually be doing for our own final examination. And basically, our final examination is going to be an essay exam. What I'm going to be doing is giving a series of essay questions, 3 or so, and asking you to choose one and to write a well-developed essay. And based on the criteria that we've been talking about, that's code. A well-developed essay is 5 or more paragraphs. That's basically what we're working towards. And of course, when you're writing something in the moment, let's say over a period of hours rather than a period of days or a period of weeks, it's not going to be as well written or as developed, but you still want to be able to communicate fairly clearly. So what I wanted to do was to give you an idea of what that final would look like on the 22nd when I have practice final scheduled. So what I'll do is I'll give you a series of questions with some instructions on how to proceed with those questions. And it'll just be your attendance question for that particular class. That said, it'll give you an idea what you would actually experience during the final exam. And for our final, because we are an online class rather than meeting in person, you have 24 hours in which to complete that particular essay. If we were meeting in class, you would have 2 hours to complete that essay, but because it's an online class, I wanted to give you the 24-hour period. Again, it's not supposed to be as well written or as developed as perhaps something that you would do on your own. But you still should be able to communicate. And As we move forward, you'll know that we've been talking about quotation and how to use that piece of punctuation in order to indicate when you're using somebody else's language. And we've also talked a little bit about how you can change things within a quotation so that you could omit something in a quote and you would use an ellipsis or the three dots or the three periods to indicate that you left out a word or a phrase, purely because it was just too long, not because you wanted to change the meaning. Or you could also use some square brackets within a quote to indicate that you are inserting your own language into that quote. Not to comment on the quote, but basically to give some clarity. If something needed to be clarified, let's say a pronoun where you were using the word, let's say, it. And it could refer to any of number of things because in the sentence you're talking about books and you are also talking about food and you are also talking about music. So when you mention it based on the way that sentence is constructed, it could be unclear if the it is referencing the food or the books or the music. So what you could do after the word it is in square brackets, write the word that the it is referencing, for instance, food, so that it would be very clear that the it meant the food, even though the word food didn't appear in the original quotation. And you would do that again with square brackets, not with parentheses. So all of these rules come from a particular place. It's called the MLA, the Modern Language Association. And basically, this is the association for the rules of how to write in the humanities. There are a separate set of rules for the sciences that's known as the APA, or the American Psychological Association. But we're not concerned with the sciences, we're concerned with English. So things like English classes and history classes, for instance, use the MLA. And basically, they have not just rules in terms of grammar and mechanics, which is what we've been discussing over the course of the semester, but they also have rules about quotation because you want to not just indicate with quotation marks when you are using somebody else's language, but you also want to give the reader a clue as to where they could find the quote and look it up on their own and verify it and make sure that you quoted correctly. And the way we do that in the MLA, and it can be different in other systems, but the way we do this in the MLA is through something called parenthetical documentation, which sounds a lot more scary than it really is. Parenthetical means parentheses. Documentation means how do you document or show inside of the parentheses where the quote comes from. So basically, what you do is that after your quote, and it doesn't matter whether your sentence is done or not. So this could be mid-sentence or this could be at the ending of the sentence. But after your quote, whether your sentence is finished or not, you open up your parentheses, and within the parentheses, you put the least amount of information necessary for the reader to be able to figure out where that quote comes from. And then you close your parentheses, and either you end your sentence or you continue on with your sentence, whatever the case may be. So what is the least amount of information that a reader probably needs in order to be able to verify that quote? That would probably be the page number. That's assuming that the reader knows which book you are referencing when you are talking about that particular page number. So what I wanted us to do by the ending of the semester was to practice not only quoting. It's one of the reasons why we've been reading these essays, because eventually our last writing assignment is going to ask you to quote from one of the essays and to respond to one of the essays. And you can see in the notes below under the section with parenthetical documentation, I gave some examples of what that would look like. So one example is the author S. Suzuki states, and then there's a comma because we know we're supposed to use a comma before we introduce a quote. Quote, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's, there are few. Unquote. And then you can see I opened up a parentheses. I put it in bold so that you could very easily see it, but it does not need to be bolded. And then I have the number 1, and then I close parentheses, and then I have a period. And basically what that means is that on page 1 of Suzuki's article or book is where you can find that particular quote. And the assumption is that you as reader know which book or article I'm referencing. So it would be enough to just state the page number. If it was unclear which book you're referencing, because maybe you're doing research on your own, so I don't know where or what Suzuki is, or what they wrote. Or perhaps it could be that there are multiple texts by the same author, let's say Suzuki, so it could be one of many. Then you have to put more information in those parentheses, something like, let's say, the author's last name, or maybe even part of the title and the author's last name, depending on what the situation happens to be. And the MLA continues on, about ways that you document at the end, all of the information at the very ending of your paper, things like the place of publication and the publisher and so forth. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that, but basically I just wanted to introduce you to the MLA at this particular point in time. And notice that in the example I gave you below, there also is another example where the sentence doesn't end after the quote. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. Or actually, I should say, quote, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's, there are few, unquote. And then you can see immediately after that, I open up my parentheses, put the number 1, close my parentheses, and then I have a comma after the closing parentheses because I'm continuing on with my sentence. So again, the quote doesn't necessarily mean, or the parenthetical documentation doesn't necessarily mean that you're ending your sentence. You can just continue on. But you put the parentheses immediately after the quote. You don't put it at the ending of the sentence. Regardless of how that sentence is constructed, it's immediately after the quote. It could be that the quote ends the sentence, so then that means it's going to be at the ending of the sentence. But if the quote does not end the sentence, then you just continue on with your sentence. And as you can see in the example below, in the 4th section, that after I've have the quote, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's, there are few, unquote. And then in the parenthetical documentation, the 1, and then my comma, and then I continue on with my sentence, states the author as Suzuki, and then I end my sentence. And as you can see the notes below, that the MLA system continues because there are different ways to indicate if you are quoting from a book as opposed to an internet site, as opposed to a television show. And all of this would be listed at the very ending of your paper. But I think that's enough for now, especially because I wanted to talk about our next essay, Propaganda Techniques in Today's Advertising. And this is on page 338 to 343. And once again, what I've done is I've outlined, much like I've outlined in the previous 2 essays, the major points of that particular essay. Because first you have to read it. Remember, we talked about reading skills at the beginning of the semester, where first you skim and you do a little bit of pre-reading. And then what you do is you read it well and you try to take notes, and then you reread it. But basically what I've done here is I've indicated the thesis, which you may not know initially. You might have to read the essay once or a couple of times before you can actually determine the thesis. And even though I put the thesis first, that might be the very last thing that you're able to determine. You might have to do your note-taking first. The thesis is that, and you can probably tell this from the title, advertising manipulates the viewer with propaganda. Because the title is Propaganda Techniques in Today's Advertising. So a title, as you know, is supposed to give the reader a sense of what your particular essay is about. It doesn't have to necessarily be a complete sentence, your title. It should be a few words that basically is related to whatever your main point is. So this is a good title, Propaganda Techniques in Today's Advertising, for the thesis that advertising manipulates the viewer with propaganda. So some of the main points that are made in this essay, that advertising targets the subconscious to seduce, to brainwash, and to deceive. In fact, I used to teach a class in advertising where we would talk about just that there is the literal message that you see in the advertisement, but there's a lot of suggestion in advertising too. For instance, sexuality is oftentimes used to sell products that have absolutely nothing to do with sexuality, but sex sells. So the idea of putting somebody who is physically attractive in an ad is one way that you could sell something like, I don't know, coffee or household cleaner. Now, propaganda, there's a definition of this. This is the systematic effort to influence people's opinions. The systematic effort to influence people's opinions. And usually we talk about propaganda in the context of governments, that governments try to influence people's opinions. But certainly advertisers can do this as well. And advertising is part of our environment. And we see over 500 advertising claims daily. So there really is no way to escape advertising. And there are techniques that are used in advertising that basically are effective. What they shouldn't necessarily be effective, but they oftentimes are effective. Things like name calling, using names in negative ways. Think about how this is done in politics by calling somebody a liberal or calling somebody a conservative, where all of a sudden these have become both, in some ways, almost like curse words, negative. Or what's known as a glittering generality. The terms are so vague that they're hard to define at all. Think about a term like all American. I mean, what exactly does that mean? It's so general. Or transfer, the idea of linking a product or with some sort of a respected thing. In other words, you're linking a cell phone with something like a bald eagle, that the idea that the bald eagle is supposed to represent patriotism. So if you buy that cell phone, that means that you are also patriotic. Or testimonials. This is where you get a famous endorsement for a product from somebody who is a celebrity. So they're famous, but they don't necessarily have expertise. This is somebody who might be an actor or a singer or another kind of entertainer. Again, trying to sell you something that isn't necessarily related to their profession. So you might have, again, an actor trying to convince you to take a certain cold medication. The reality is that this is an actor, this is not a medical professional, but the assumption is that if you respect the actor, then chances are you might be more likely to want to use that particular product. What's known as the plain folks testimonial, that you are connecting your product with average people, ordinary folks. I don't know if you remember the Saturn cars. They went bankrupt eventually, but they try to do that ordinary folks, basically, just the average American would be driving a Saturn. Or you could do something like card stacking, which is suppressing or distorting evidence. When you say a product helps control dandruff, you're not saying that it controls dandruff. You're saying that it helps control dandruff. So this is a way of not necessarily being completely truthful. The bandwagon idea, the pressure to conform, to join everybody else, that this is the number one product, therefore that's why you should want to buy it, because it's the number one product, that if everybody else is using it, you should want to use it as well. I call this the teenage argument. Just because everybody else is going to the party, I don't know if that means that that's enough of an argument for you to go to the party. So that gives you an idea of some of the major points in that particular essay. And you can see that our attendance question is going to be based on that essay that I've just reviewed. But do note that our attendance question is usually due 24 hours after our class. But 24 hours after our class would put us into Thursday, Veterans Day, which is a day in which there are no classes. So I'm giving an extension for your attendance question. That'll be due on Friday instead of Thursday. That'll be the 12th of November at 10 a.m. If you don't necessarily have to hand it in your attendance question during a holiday, if you don't necessarily want to or are able to. And the attendance question, and again, note the extension because of Veterans Day. The attendance question is, do you agree, disagree, or both that advertising manipulates our subconscious, and why? Do you agree, disagree, or both that advertising manipulates our subconscious, and why? So I'm curious to hear what you have to say. And again, these are the kinds of questions for which there are no right or wrong answers. It's more about your thinking and your rationale. And I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about other punctuation marks in our next essay. Take care. Bye-bye.